So now I had two rival explanations from different Christians on why these pre-Christian pagan religions could contain reports of events such as the virgin birth that supposedly hadn't happened until the time period of Jesus. So again, those two rival explanations. Some Christians told me it was because Satan pre-plagiarized the New Testament. Other Christians said maybe God put those stories there in order to better prepare the pagan world with hints of the truth to come. That is, by planting these different virgin birth stories in different religions in different centuries here and there, this would make the pagan world more accepting of the idea by the time that Jesus arrived. Of course, there are also Christians who told me they just didn't know, or that the subject really wasn't all that important anyway, because faith in Christ is all that matters. And all this stuff is just dusty history. But none of those types of responses ended up in the text of my Christian character. Because my character is not only a proselytizer, he's also an apologist. And apologists tend not to give answers like faith is all that matters. Instead, knowledgeable apologists can give specific explanations for everything. And they'll also explain how their answers are based on logic and evidence. Now, both the demonic pre-plagiarization and this hints of truth idea, they were better than anything I could have come up with on my own. But I still wasn't sure that either was the best explanation possible. So I tested these answers out in my Christian Yahoo discussion group and with Christian friends and coworkers and with Christian proselytizers on the street. And I wanted to see if there was a clear preference for one direction or the other. I also wanted to see if anyone could come up with an even better explanation. For better or worse, I couldn't find anyone who could further improve upon these answers. And most Christians seemed more or less satisfied with one answer or the other. But the ones who liked the idea that it was God who planted these virgin birth stories in pagan religions, these tended to be more the New Age type of Christians, the type that believes that Christianity is a path to God, but not the only path. And these New Age types tend not to be proselytizers, because if you believe that God shows up in lots of religions and that there are many paths to God, it just doesn't logically follow that you would be warning people they have to accept Jesus as the only path to avoiding eternal hellfire. So to keep the character of my proselytizer as consistent as possible, I had him explain the appearance of pre-Christian virgin birth stories in pagan religions by quoting Tertullian and quoting Justin Martyr and standing behind their argument, which again, Satan pre-plagiarized the New Testament, planted those stories in pagan religions to confuse people. Now, as for my skeptic's response to this explanation, I try to stick to using the Socratic method, which means I don't ever say anything like, well, that's one of the stupidest things I ever heard, or anything confrontational or anything insulting like that. Because that kind of attack generally just leads to a counterattack. And the issues themselves, they get lost very quickly that way. Instead, the Socratic method means you try to use people's own arguments against them. So in this case, I try to get the proselytizer himself to invalidate this pre-plagiarization idea. So what my skeptic says to the proselytizer is, well, okay, let's say that this demonic pre-plagiarization is a valid argument or a valid loophole for explaining why a religion can look like it took its ideas from other religions, but it really didn't. If that loophole is valid, I don't see why other religions couldn't fit through it as well. Let's take Sikhism, for example. If it's true that demonic forces can pre-plagiarize a religion, well, maybe it only looks like Sikhism borrowed from Hinduism and Islam. Maybe demonic forces created the half-wrong Hinduism in, 3000 BC or so, and then these demons created the half-wrong Islam in the 600s AD, and this was because these demonic forces knew that God would inspire the true religion of Sikhism in the 1500s, and these evil forces wanted people to be confused about where Sikhism was really coming from. Now, during the course of the conversation between the skeptic and the apologist, my skeptic does acknowledge that this demonic pre-plagiarization idea may seem like a convoluted rationalization to defend Sikhism from the much more plausible explanation that it really did borrow from Hinduism and Islam. But what my skeptic adds is that he doesn't see how it's any less convoluted than saying that the New Testament was satanically pre-plagiarized. My apologist, in turn, explains how the demonic pre-plagiarization idea really is nonsensical when applied to foreign faiths like Hinduism or Voodoo, Buddhism to some extent, and all other religions that can trace many of their doctrines back to pre-existing religions. But my apologist also maintains that it's wholly valid when it comes to the Bible. And I won't go into all the details, but I'll just summarize by saying that as far as the skeptic can tell, there's no rational reason for saying that the Bible deserves to be classified as an exception. That is, there's no reason for what's sometimes called special pleading. And this type of stalemate is reached in several other areas too, like when it comes to the limited knowledge of the universe that we find in ancient texts. Apologists will explain that when it comes to biblical passages that seem to imply that the sun is orbiting the earth, or that the stars are tiny, or the earth is flat, well, that's all just God speaking in metaphor. All right, to be continued in part 5.